He has a responsibility to call out extremism and to call out those who do or may support very extremist views. And there have been examples of imams that have preached very, very strong sermons which support various organisations. And I'm glad to see that Sajid, in his speech today, his counter-terrorism speech, actually praised the Muslim community for what they're doing.
But do you think the Muslim Council of Britain is also guilty, then, of supporting extremism in some way?
I'm not aware of those allegations, and I wouldn't be able to say it. But I think to go back to a mayoral campaign that was 2 years ago, I would argue that the party has moved on. We've put this new process in place in November, and I would say to the Muslim Council of Britain, give me examples of where that's not working.
So let's give an example. Let's give an example straight up. I mean, there's an MP, Bob Blackman, who's the MP for Harrow East. He retweeted Tommy Robinson, an anti-Muslim tweet from Tommy Robinson. He was made aware of it. He didn't delete it straight away. It took a while for that to happen. Secondly, he hosted Tapan Ghosh, an anti-Muslim extremist, in Parliament. He says that it's important to challenge views and to have those
explain who Tapan Ghosh is.
Tapan Ghosh is an anti-Muslim extremist who made a number of very vile comments talking about Muslims in many different ways, and it's been accepted generally, including by...
But I think
they're not here to defend themselves, but what do you say broadly to them?
I would say that those incidents were a while ago. Certainly the tweet that you refer to was back in 2016. It was deleted. Bob Blackman has apologised for it, as I understand. But very importantly, the new agenda that has been put in place for elected representatives, councillors, those candidates, to make sure that we respect all races, all sections of society, and that clear process has been put in place.
But when you say move on, that we've moved on from the London mayoral contest, so should that campaign, which was deemed by many people to be anti-Muslim in tone at the very highest level within the Conservative Party, should that just be forgotten about?
Well, I didn't like that campaign. I have to say, personally, I didn't agree with the way that the campaign was run. I didn't like that campaign, and I didn't feel that the tone was right. But we have a different Prime Minister now. We have a Prime Minister who's very committed. As you said, Sajid Javid has now been promoted into Cabinet, and I would like to think that the party, as the MPs that were elected in 2015 and again in 2017, are broad-minded, open-minded, and I would hope not the kind of people that would indulge in any kind of Islamophobic
Miqdad,
comments.
do you accept these new measures that are being put in place? Will that go some way to dealing with your concerns?
I think that's all. It's very good that this respect pledge has come out. Nobody would say anything otherwise. The fact, though, that, for example, Bob Blackman has continued to do certain things and have come out in the media more recently in terms of retweeting other things are problematic. But I think that we have to look much more broadly than that. In the letter that Lord Sheikh wrote to the Prime Minister, he talked about much more institutional issues within the party, about listening to Muslim communities like the Conservative Muslim Forum. There are many issues that have been talked about that are challenges. And what I'm saying, I think this is really important, is that if we want to ensure that politics is for everybody and is open to everybody, let's have a magnifying glass on this. Let's have transparency on this issue, and let's look at this issue in a way that the leading members of the Muslim communities within the Conservative Party, like Baroness Warsi, like Lord Sheikh and others, and the Muslim Council of Britain, as the largest umbrella body of Muslim organisations in this country, have talked about.
Right.
Well, listen to that concern.
I know that we are very open. Women to Win, for example, I mentor a Muslim woman who's trying to get elected as an MP, and I think we're very open to having much greater representation in the party. We would love people from all ethnic backgrounds to join the Conservatives, stand for Parliament. We've got really good support networks, and that's something that I would like to see, that we encourage more candidates from BAME communities to come forward and stand for the Conservative Party.
Can I talk to you about how representative you really are? Because you say that you represent a large number, or the largest number, of Muslim organisations as an umbrella group. But you heard Sajid Javid saying the Muslim Council of Britain doesn't represent Muslims in this country. You find me a group of Muslims that thinks that they're represented by the MCB. Can you find a group of Muslims that feel they're represented by you?
I mean, we have over 500 affiliate organisations across the country who pay our subscription, who are part of the Muslim Council of Britain. We had a concern about the issue of Islamophobia, and over 350 mosques just yesterday came out and said very clearly, Muslim organisations came out and said that they agree with the Muslim Council of Britain approach. Let's talk about specifically the issue of whether we represent Muslims on the ground.
What does that mean, Muslims on the ground?
Okay,
I mean, the Home
Muslim
Secretary has said, the Muslim community, like every other community, is not a single homogenous community.
We say the same
An
thing.
ICM poll in 2016, which was a very big poll of Muslims, said only 2% of British Muslims saw the MCB as their representative organisation.
Well, I mean, the BBC Editorial Complaints Unit said that was an inaccurate representation of that poll.
So what percentage would you put it at?
Well, I mean, there are only 2 polls which have been done on this issue. That's not a poll which is done on this issue. It's done on a completely different issue, which the BBC Editorial Complaints Unit itself said was inaccurate.
So what would you put it as?
I don't want to put myself, because I can't know that number. But what I can say, though, is that Comres did a poll for the BBC, and it said that the majority of Muslims are represented by the Muslim Council of Britain.
The great thing about polls.
Exactly. Well, I think this is different, though. This is a completely different question. This question was considered to be inaccurate. So
right.
I think that we should not compare something which is inaccurate to 2 polls, and not just one, by the way. A separate poll which was done by Channel 4, which again asked the question: Do you think the Muslim Council of Britain is doing a good job in representing your views? And a majority again said yes.
Well, if the majority said that, Sajid Javid is completely talking out of turn, isn't he, by saying they are unrepresentative in any shape, sense or form, and his tone was quite hostile.
Well, he obviously made his point, and he said what he said. I'm not going to go behind his view and his opinion. Clearly, he stated his opinion, but I think he is very committed to making sure that the Muslim voice is heard in government.
Let me talk to Marsha, because she hasn't had a chance to contribute to this conversation. Marsha, the anti-extremism programme, PREVENT, was something actually that the Labour government, the last Labour government, actually put in place. But they too cut off relations with the MCB. Why do you think that was?
I mean, obviously, I can't comment on the reasons behind that, but what I will say in relation to what the report that the Muslim Council for Britain has come out with, and also what other leading figures within the Conservative Party have highlighted, that there is a clear problem with Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. And Baroness Fazli has been campaigning on this issue for many years, and she's also been lobbying the Prime Minister on the issue as well. And I think it's really important that all parties must ensure that they root out any form of racism or Islamophobia. The Conservative Party recently reinstated a councillor who compared Asians to dogs. I mean, this is unacceptable and must be rooted out at every level within any party structure.
All right.
Do you agree with that on anti-Semitism, then?
Well, actually, as with wider society, there is a problem. There was a problem in the Labour Party with anti-Semitism, and it's been dealt with, and we are rooting it out. So I think we've moved on, and those issues are being addressed by the new General Secretary, who has put processes in place to ensure that this issue is tackled. And like the Conservative Party, any issue of racism must be tackled and must be rooted out.
So do you think you'll support the respect agenda to make sure that your councillors and your candidates sign up to that?
Well, our party already have processes in place to ensure that all of our elected representatives adhere to a higher standard. The Labour Party is the party of equality, and we hold ourselves already to a higher standard.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but Miqdad, I'm afraid we haven't got any more time, but thank you for coming in. Now, all this comes as the Home Secretary has this morning been outlining the government's revised counter-terrorism strategy. As well as recommitting his support for the government's PREVENT scheme, Mr Javid discussed new plans for MI5 to share information on suspects across government, local authorities and the police. The Home Secretary said his top priority was to keep the country safe.
Ultimately, our approach is about ensuring that there are no safe spaces for terrorists. No safe spaces internationally, in which terrorist ideology can develop and from where complex attacks can be launched. No safe spaces in the UK for terrorists to spread their vile views or for them to plan and carry out attacks. And no safe spaces online for terrorist propaganda and technical expertise to be shared and for people to be relaxed.
Kate, first of all, what did you make of the speech?
Well, obviously, this came about as a result of the London and Manchester terror attacks. And the whole point was to look at what the UK was doing wrong and what it could do better to prevent attacks in the next instance. Because obviously, Sajid Javid's saying today we can't prevent all attacks. But actually, at the heart of this policy are a number of smaller tweaks. So things like sharing more information that MI5 gathers with broader partners, particularly locally. So people who were already sharing information on the PREVENT programme, which aims to prevent people from being radicalised into extremism, those types of people will now get more information about other people who may be on the fringes, they may be attending speeches, they may be doing other things that have flagged them up in the wider course of MI5 and MI6's work, but actually they're not the main focus of terror investigations. So sharing more information on that front, and then interestingly asking the private sector to share more information with the intelligence services, particularly when people are maybe buying things that might be suspicious or hiring vehicles or a pattern of behaviour that might suggest that they could be looking to plan an attack. And then the government wants to be able to pick up those attacks sooner and have tougher sentences for people when they do plot terror attacks or when they aid and abet terror attacks. So that's kind of at the heart of this strategy.
Right. And Owen, what do you think the response will be that actually the onus to some extent is being put on other agencies, or more burden you could see it as being put on other agencies when they're already busy?
I think that's going to be the main complaint, isn't it? It's all very well asking people to do more, but have they got the resources to do it? We know that a lot of people like neighbourhood policing, where a lot of this intelligence actually comes from, has been quite hit by the cuts there's been to funding. So that's going to be the area where people say we want to do more. It's not that we don't want to do this, but actually are you going to give us the resources to do it? I thought the speech from Sajid, he kind of said all the right things. He repeated the phrase, you know, my name is Sajid Javid and I'm leading this. This shows that this is something which is coming from someone who understands all these kind of issues. But when you talk about things like PREVENT, the Manchester bomber, for example, was someone who had been flagged up and it wasn't action. So some people would say, look, we are flagging up when there is matters of concern, but is it actually being dealt with? Are there the resources there to actually deal with these concerns when they're raised?
Now, Kate, what about this idea? Sajid Javid said the turnaround for plots is much quicker these days. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, so he's saying that plots aren't made in pubs anymore or bars, and actually Ben Wallace, the security minister, this morning on the radio was saying when he was in Northern Ireland, a lot of the time people would meet up physically in person, and that doesn't happen anymore. Most of these plots are people who speak to each other online, they talk on platforms that have end-to-end encryption, so it's very difficult for the security services to pick those up, and that's why they are doing what they're doing, which is broadening out the early warning system, the flags. And as Owen said, a lot of this information is collected already or shared already, but not necessarily acted on in the right way, so that's part of this strategy. The other part is asking people like Google and Twitter and Facebook, and actually smaller platforms as well, to get better at identifying terrorist behaviour online. So now Twitter is using, and actually Google and Facebook are using artificial intelligence to be able to flag when people might be plotting a terror plot, when they might be looking at extremist material online, and to be able to remove those tweets and messages and videos earlier before they even sometimes can be shared more widely. So that's another big part of this strategy, and Sajid Javid saying today that the focus has to shift from community policing, for the most part, where people might be meeting up in person, and onto the broader kind of terror policing and making sure that people are aware of what goes on online, and even things like purchasing online, so Amazon and bigger retailers, getting them to share information about what people are buying, what people are doing, what people are using. But that does present some questions about privacy and about data and about how much data should be shared, particularly actually when a lot of these people won't have committed crimes yet. They may be on the fringes, but they may not have actually done anything wrong.
What about Sajid Javid himself, Owen? What do you make of him? He's making waves clearly on a number of issues, on immigration, counter-terrorism today. He talked about police resources over the last week or so. His stock is high?
Absolutely. He's clearly a man in a hurry who wants to get things done. There's two areas I think he's trying to separate himself out from Amber Rudd. And number one is that Amber Rudd was always seen as being in the shadow of Theresa May, her immediate predecessor in the Home Office. And also, as Kate said, talking about things like encryption, not using phrases like relevant hashtags, which actually exposed a lack of understanding of a lot of what was going on online. Sajid Javid wants to show he's across the detail. We saw yesterday with his interview on Andrew Marr that he had the capacity to create a lot of news, whether it was about taking students out of the immigration figures, whether it was about lifting the cap on non-EU doctors to come over and fill vacancies in the NHS, talking about Islamophobia, as you were talking about before. This is a man who clearly wants to be his own Home Secretary. He doesn't want to necessarily sort of bend the knee to Theresa May. He's quite happy to go in and tear up some of her legacy. And, you know, let's face it, this is a guy who could be the next leader of the Tory party.
Right, thank you both very much. All those emergency vehicles rushing past you, rushing behind you at the time as we're talking about all of this. We didn't arrange it, I promise. Thank you. Antoinette, just briefly picking up where we left off in the last discussion, and we were talking with Marcia about the PREVENT strategy. Yes. Is it wise to continue with that strategy unreformed when it is clearly unpopular with certain sections of the Muslim community, including the Muslim Council of Britain?
I think it is really important to continue with that strategy, and it has had support from other sections of the Muslim community. It's very important to have a process where, and it's not just in relation to the Muslim community, actually in relation to far-right extremist threats as well. It's important to identify those and to try and help de-radicalise.
What about this sharing of information, Marcia, with councils, with other government agencies? Is that going to be productive, or is it going to put too much burden on them?
I think declassifying information and sharing that with local authorities and other government departments is a good thing. But again, if, you know, local authorities, etc., they have a capacity and a resource issue. So we have to ensure that there is enough resource in place to ensure that this information being passed on can be dealt with and looked into. I think that's really going to be...
Should more funding go to the LGA?
Well, I think where your piece pointed out was that actually cyber is where much of this is taking place, and £2 billion is being committed into cyber, particularly up in the northwest, actually.
And is it enough, though, to help other agencies deal with this important issue?
I think it's an important step, and, you know, I'm sure that the Chancellor would love to give more money, but we're limited and we have to allocate resources. I think £2 billion is a lot of extra additional funding, and I have to say that work supports the work of our security services in identifying and tackling threats, which is really important.
Is that enough, Marcia?
But what you have to also remember with all these new announcements, the Home Secretary said yesterday that there isn't any additional money coming in, and we know that there isn't any additional money for policing. And I think, yes, there is the issue around cyber, but, you know, what we do need is more community and neighbourhood policing, because they are rooted in their communities. And actually, and I think that's a really important step that needs to be considered in all of this when we look at counter-terrorism in the whole and in the main.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on in the programme, because I'll be speaking to the government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Max Hill. Now, a customs union deal, a single market deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. Well, we thought we'd heard about all the deals possible, but now Open Europe, a think tank specialising in UK-EU relations, has another proposal for us. Their director, Henry Newman, joins us now to discuss the latest idea for life after Brexit. So, hit us. What's the latest deal?
Well, we think as you look at the debate that's happening in Parliament at the moment and in Westminster more generally, there are these two extreme axes. You've got the sort of hardline Remainers on one side and hardline Leavers on the other. And actually there's a pragmatic path in the centre, which I think is where the majority of the population and the majority of businesses are. And that would recognise that on goods, the EU is by far our largest market, and about half of our goods trade is with the EU, and it makes sense for us to align with their rules and regulations, something that would happen even if we left without a deal. But on services, which is 4/5 of our economy, we're too big and too important a country to be a rule taker, and we need to therefore have the ability to go our own way.
So are you saying that we should, in effect, stay in the single market when it comes to goods and accept all the rules that go with that?
Not literally in the single market. We'd have alignment on goods rules, and we'd be able to participate in the single market on terms roughly similar to that of Switzerland or the Ukraine.
Right, so including continuation of freedom of movement, like Switzerland?
No, that would not involve freedom of movement, is our proposal. Now, obviously, this is subject to negotiation, but the point is...
Well, clearly, because the EU would say they would reject that.
Well, quite, but I think the way the debate is framed here in the UK is you've got this choice, on the one hand, of a free trade deal like Canada, or the other hand, a sort of close relationship in the single market, essentially, like Norway. And we're saying that if you actually look at the structure of the deals that the EU has already done, Switzerland, the Ukraine, various other association agreements, there are lots of other options in the middle that offer very helpful precedents.
So you're looking for this bespoke deal, something that is specifically tailored for the UK. Why do you think there's been no progress along those sorts of lines till now?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the hung Parliament and the divisions within the Conservative Party as well means that the government is being pulled in two directions simultaneously. And also, I think from the other side, the Commission is not really engaging with any of the detail. And although they love to criticise the UK's red lines, I'm not sure the Commission themselves have a clear plan as to where they want the EU relationship to end up.
Right.
So,
I mean, Henry, at the weekend, you will know and have read that some of the scenarios, possible scenarios, in a document have been looked at by Whitehall in the event of a no deal that did suggest, in the worst-case scenario, that Britain could run out of food and fuel and medicine. What did you make of that?
Well, I thought it was pretty far-fetched, and certainly that was the sort of scenario that could only possibly happen if no action was taken by the government to prepare for such eventualities. But I don't think we're going to leave without a deal. I think, obviously, both sides should prepare for all eventualities, but I think the chances are, and everything that we've seen so far through the negotiation, the breakthrough in December, the breakthrough in March, suggests that they are committed to reaching an agreement. So I'm confident that we will get
You still like the UK to be in the single market as well as the customs union?
My view is that the report is a welcome first step, and it acknowledges things that I've been arguing for a long time about areas that will impact in my constituency, so aerospace, chemicals, car manufacturing and so on. It's a recognition, really, that in terms of customs and goods, there needs to be that kind of agreement. But I would argue that services should not be left out of it. There may be an argument for some elements of financial services to be left out, but the insurance industry, legal services and so on face huge non-tariff barriers if we don't adopt an EEA-style agreement. And I would say it's a welcome step that Henry has accepted that an EFTA-style compromise is a good platform to start from, but I would argue an EEA-style compromise.
And what do you say to that, Henry? That it should be more like the European Economic Area and should include services and customs union?
We don't think we should be in a customs union. We think we need to have the ability to control our trade, and that is something that we think was settled during the referendum by the democratic decision in 2016. In terms of services, the single market is obviously not complete in services, but even in those fields where it's most advanced, like financial services, less than 40% of our exports are actually going to the EU. And I think for people like Antoinette, who would argue that we, as a member, were able to shape the rules around the table in Brussels and were able to block rules that wouldn't be favourable, they also need to recognise that if we're not sitting around the table, it's particularly difficult for us to remain bound by those rules if we can't shape them.
It's a myth to say that, for example, Norway and Switzerland don't shape the rules. There are processes for both of those countries to have a very significant impact on.
But they're not at the table, are they, Antoinette?
They're not voting, but they are at the table. They have a very early input. They are involved right from the start, as the Norwegian Foreign Minister has said. And I think it's a myth to say that they are rule takers, because they actually have an opportunity to input right from the start.
Marsha, what do you think of the plan?
Well, I think for Labour's position on post-Brexit has to be ensuring that we have a strong relationship with the EU and ensuring that we have good alignment with the single market as well. So we would ensure that we could negotiate our own bespoke deal with the EU, and that is also coupled together because we do believe in having a UK-EU customs union.
Right, but what about the single market? Would you personally be in favour of staying so closely aligned to the single market that, in effect, we would be part of it?
I mean, ultimately, again, it goes back to the negotiations that the Labour Party would seek to have, and it would be to have a good, close and comprehensive relationship with the single market that gives us some benefits. So I think that has to be the way going forward. But I also think it's worth pointing out now that also the government are currently quite divided on this whole issue. They don't.
So is the Labour Party. Let's face it. I mean, there's no unanimity in the Labour Party.
But the government are so divided that they haven't got a clear vision for Brexit. We don't know what they've ruled out a customs union, but we don't know what kind of customs arrangement they do want. They've ruled out anything to do with the single market, but we don't know what that actually looks like.
Labour plans don't make sense either. And in particular, you don't want to accept, for example, state aid rules, which you would be required to accept if you were in a customs union. Mm-hmm. I think the important thing from the report is that Henry has accepted that we will become a rule taker on goods anyway. If we want to export, if we want to have our supply chains into the EU, and I can see him nodding, that we will have to become a rule taker in that area anyway, and that's what business is saying.
But Antoinette,
the non-tariff barriers in the services sector are absolutely key. We have 30 million EEA residents who have insurance policies from UK insurance companies. We really have to look at the service sector, there may be limited areas of the financial services where we do need to have mutual recognition.
All right.
And I think mutual recognition is key.
But there are many in your party who regard that sort of talk as mutinous, as betraying the party. I mean, how has it been for you and some of your Conservative colleagues to be labelled in that way?
Well, I think it's ridiculous because we voted for Article 50. We are pragmatists. We are pragmatic Remainers that want to leave in a way that does the least damage to our economy and that leaves the hated political institutions of the EU Parliament and the EU Commission. And what this allows us to do, and many Leavers during the Leave campaign were holding up Norway and Switzerland as the kind of countries that we should be emulating.
Right, but are you going to vote against the government when these amendments that were passed in the Lords come to the Commons on issues like remaining in a customs union or considering remaining in a customs union?
I need to see what the government amendments are to the EU withdrawal bill and what will come forward from the government. And at the moment, we haven't seen that. But the customs amendment from the House of Lords talks about a report being laid in front of the House of Commons about the discussions that the government has had on a customs union. It is not calling for a customs union. And I'm a pragmatist. I want an outcome that allows the free and frictionless trade that we were promised, the exact same benefits as before.
And do you accept that could bring down the government? If you vote against it and it's defeated on a key plank of its Brexit policy?
I absolutely don't. We have a fixed-term Parliament. We have, and I have full confidence in Theresa May. My view is that I want her to have the opportunity to negotiate the deal that she wants, but I think there should be a legislative backstop in the legislation in relation to what is being written into the legislation.
Henry Newman, thank you very much. For more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website. That's bbc.co.uk/Brexit. Now, Marsha de Cordova, as well as being a Labour MP, is also the Shadow Minister for Disabled People. It's a subject she knows plenty about, as she herself is registered blind. She's made a short film for us about what that means in her day-to-day work.
My name is Marsha de Cordova. I'm the Member of Parliament for Battersea. I was elected last June 2017. I was born with a condition called nystagmus, which is an involuntary movement of the eyes. So you'll probably see now that my eyes are wobbling left to right and up and down, and that causes me to be severely visually impaired. Because of my restricted sight or my sight loss, it means that I obviously have to overcome a number of various barriers. I can't read standard print, so I have to have all my papers in large print. So, for example, the order paper, this is a standard size order paper, and the order paper pretty much is the agenda of the day's business, but the order paper that I would have has to be produced in large print. There are times when my papers aren't ready, so if we are debating a particular bill, I expect to have my amendment papers in advance, and that hasn't happened. Most recently, I didn't get the papers until when the bill was actually being debated in the chamber, which frankly is unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since my promotion to Shadow Minister for Disabled People, I obviously have to speak from the dispatch box. When I have my papers, they tend to have to be in really large fonts, which is fine, but what it means is one question could go on to about 4 or 5 pages. Can the Minister advise when they will finally publish their response to the Work, Health and Disability Green Paper? In my constituency, I have a number of organisations and groups for people with disabilities, ranging from sight loss to learning disabilities. A particular charity called Share Community are doing brilliant work with people living with learning disabilities, and for people, particularly those that are disabled in my constituency, to actually know that they've got a Member of Parliament with a disability, I hope it inspires them. If I get on the bus, how do you get around?
Me? Bus.
Bus?
2 buses for me, and then that's it.
Yeah.
And then go home, and that's it.
Yeah. I want to see more disabled people in work, and we need to ensure that those societal barriers aren't in place that prevents them from getting into work.
Well, Marsha, we'll talk a little bit about your, obviously, your priority of getting more disabled people back into work. But first of all, it's been nearly a year.
Yes.
How would you sum it up? Your first year in Parliament.
Oh, I mean, obviously, for me, it's just a huge privilege to serve as the Member of Parliament for Battersea. I'm thrilled. And the last year has been really interesting. I mean, what I found in Parliament at the moment, when you're in the chamber, just the strength and the power of some of those debates are actually quite moving. And, I mean, highlights for me would include giving my maiden speech and having my mum there with me and things like that. You know, you would remember what it was like as well, Antoinette.
Well, it wasn't that long ago either, was it? But how has it been for somebody like you who is registered blind?
I mean, obviously, Parliament still has a long way to go in terms of ensuring that, you know, access is worked out. And I'm pleased that as part of the whole restoration programme, accessibility will be at the heart of that. But obviously, for me going in there are a number of changes and adjustments that needed to be made to ensure that I can actually get around the place and actually operate and function effectively as an MP like my non-disabled colleagues. And that has been quite challenging in some areas.
I mean, what message does it send, though, that Parliament legislates on all sorts of areas and issues relating to disabled people, but isn't actually in the 21st century itself as a building, perhaps as an institution, in terms of serving people like you?
Well, obviously, as parts of the building is very, very old, and you know, when it was built, obviously disability wasn't high on the agenda, and other parts of the building are doing much better. But I think what's really important, like I remember, you know, seeing David Blunkett, who was a former Home Secretary, and you know, he was blind and he had a guide dog, and it made me believe that actually I can, you know, go into politics possibly. And I'm hoping that all the barriers that I'm facing and that I'm overcoming and breaking down will ensure that anybody that comes behind me with a disability doesn't have to face the same experiences that I've had. But also the parliamentary authorities have been open, and, you know, I will continue to be that voice for disabled people in Parliament to ensure that they get the job done and they get it done right as well.
What's been the most difficult thing to overcome then, do you think? I mean, you talked about standing at the dispatch box, and obviously you can't always read, you know, the order papers that are given to you, and allowances have to be made. What's been the biggest sort of challenge?
I think the biggest challenge for me is ensuring that when I'm in the chamber, because there are, you know, as you would know, Antoinette, when you're giving a speech, obviously it usually is time limited. So actually making sure that I'm currently reliant on my colleagues to let me know when I've got like a minute left or something, because the clock, I can't see it. So that is the biggest challenge, and trying to find a solution for that is something that we are looking at.
In terms of disabled people and trying to increase their numbers in the workplace, what would be the one thing, do you think, that would help that issue?
There isn't just one thing. I think what we have to remember is the disability employment gap has remained at 30% for the last 8 years. What we do need is a combination of two things. Firstly, we need to ensure that employer attitudes are shaped, and education and awareness is given in that area, but also schemes like the Access to Work scheme, which in my opinion is the best kept secret when it comes to employment support for disabled people, because not a lot of employers are aware of this scheme, but it provides practical and financial support for disabled people to get into work, but more importantly, stay in work should they acquire a disability. And what we've found with that scheme, unfortunately, the government have put a cap on that scheme, so those with the greatest needs potentially fall outside of that. So I would like to see an Access to Work scheme that doesn't have any arbitrary caps, but there is a scheme there for any disabled person that wants to get into and stay in work.
Antoinette?
Well, I really welcome the fact that Marsha supports that programme, and the Conservatives have got an extra 600,000 disabled people into work. We're looking at what disabled people are able to do and supporting them in their ambitions. And I know certainly a larger number of employers are being signed up as disability champions, and that every single MP is being encouraged to approach employers in their constituency to highlight the support that's available for them. And there's a national insurance holiday for employers who do take on those with disabilities. So I think those steps have been hugely welcome.
Thank you. Now, over the last few weeks, lots of us have been glued to the BBC drama A Very English Scandal, me included, starring Hugh Grant as the former Liberal leader Jeremy Thorpe, who was acquitted in 1979 of plotting to kill his former lover, Norman Scott. The drama concluded last night, but there have apparently been fresh developments in the case. Over the weekend, it emerged that the man alleged to have been hired to kill Norman Scott, Andrew Newton, is still alive. Police turned up at an address in Surrey yesterday where he is believed to have been living under a different name. Now, at the time of the trial, Panorama reporter Tom Mangold prepared a special post-verdict programme. It was scrapped when the jury returned its verdicts of not guilty for all defendants, and the programme had remained unseen until last night. In the documentary, Mangold revisited Norman Scott and asked him about current efforts to find his suspected assassin.
It looks as if Andrew Newton may still be alive, despite the fact that Gwent Police and the Crown Prosecution Service confirmed his death. What do you make of that?
I just don't. I don't think anybody's tried hard enough to look for him. I really don't. There must be people who knew him, and there would surely be record of him dying. Surely. I thought that they were doing something at last, and soon found out that absolutely they weren't. They were continuing the cover-up, as far as I can see.
Well, here in the studio is Tom Mangold, who we saw in that clip. Welcome to the Daily Politics. It's an extraordinary story, and it did grip everybody, I think, the drama of those who saw it. And it seems the story's not over. What's happened?
Well, what's happened is that some time ago I bumped into somebody in the park. This is absolutely true. Nobody believes me, but I promise you it's true.
We believe you, go on.
And it's not part of the conspiracy. I bumped into a man in the park who told me that he was actually the first contracted hitman sent down to Barnstaple to kill Norman Scott. He lost his nerve at the last moment, came back to London, gave the gun to Andrew Newton, who then went down, shot the dog, and the rest is history. Now, this man is called Dennis Meehan, and he made a full statement to Scotland Yard about the conspiracy to murder Scott. A few weeks after he made that statement, he got a phone call advising him to go to his local police station, and he found a second statement waiting for him to sign, which made no mention whatsoever of Jeremy Thorpe. And he signed it. So somebody disappeared the original statement, and had it been used at the trial, I think Jeremy would have been convicted.
You really think the verdict would have been different?
I do, yes.
Why did Gwent Police think that Andrew Newton, the alleged hitman, was dead?
Personally, I would have phoned Somerset House or the death certificate records and asked them, is he dead? I believe this was a curiously inept investigation.
Curiously inept?
Yes, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think it's part of the conspiracy at all. I think it was... I know a lot about that investigation. I think it was inept.
What do you think is going to happen now? I mean, they're reopening the investigation. Is there any point in that?
Well, I think there is, because, why has this endured for 40 years? There's a feeling out there that justice wasn't quite done, that Norman Scott was picked on because he was gay and vulnerable and needy, and that somehow did the establishment get together to cover up. And there are outstanding questions. I think we may have answered them last night with a documentary, but now it emerges that another man is there who can give a witness statement saying there was a conspiracy. And I think that would settle the matter once and for all. But we need Andrew Newton, the incredible, unprofessional hitman. We need him to confirm what Dennis Meehan said. So the cops are looking for him, and they thought he was dead. Well, got that wrong, and then they knocked on the door where he was living in Dorking yesterday.
And he's gone.
And no reply. So I think the cops then went home. So I don't know where this is going, but my guess is there will be a fresh investigation.
At the time of the trial, at the time you were doing your documentary, and he was acquitted along with the other defendants, Jeremy Thorpe, were you asked to delete that film that you had made, all the footage for the documentary?
Let me just say this. There was no attempt to censor the documentary once it had been made. That my film couldn't be shown once Jeremy Thorpe was found to be innocent.
Yes.
There was censorship in the BBC, and the BBC in the late 70s tried very hard to stop us making this investigation. It was a time when the BBC didn't really do investigations. It saw itself as a news agency that reported the news but didn't go round the back to look at what was really going on. And a lot of attempts were made to stop us. And I had a brilliant producer who knew how to work the BBC system.
Right. And what did you do with the document? Did you have it on a tape and stick it in your back pocket
No,
and keep
what
it at home?
happened was I had it on a VHS tape and I converted it. I was ordered to destroy it.
Yes.
By the then Director General. Well, in my house, you don't burn books and you don't destroy films. So I kept it and I converted it to disc. And my dog got hold of the disc and tried to eat it, which shows you what she thought of it. But
It becomes even more farcical, Tom Mangold, this thing that the dog ate your homework.
Yeah, well, she was clearly part of the conspiracy.
Yes, well, must have been. I mean, there is a farcical element to the whole story, in a sense, but it is a serious story.
Yes.
And, I mean, it was extraordinary watching it at the time, and obviously I know the story anyway pretty well. Do you think that has stopped it being taken seriously enough because it did feel a little bit like one sort of calamity after another and perhaps...
Well, you know, I've spoken to Norman Scott a lot in the last few days. He didn't see the farce in it at all. And I thought that the drama, Hugh Grant, you know, BAFTAs galore for him. Mm-hmm. But I thought the plinky-plonk music and the fun element of it, I didn't personally recognise that. I didn't identify with that, and nor did Norman. It's a story that still has legs, astonishingly, and I think it will continue for a little while yet.
Well, I've just been told that apparently 1.6 million people tune in to watch your documentary, which apparently is the highest ever, or certainly in recent times, for BBC Four. What do you think about that? People are obviously still very interested.
Well, I'm eternally grateful to my producer, who really had the whole idea in the first place, and we obviously picked up a lot from the drama, and then we got a presentational handover to BBC Four. I wish it had run a little bit earlier, that's all.
Did you watch it, Antoinette?
I have to confess I didn't, but I will.
You've been fortunately, on the move, have you?
Fortunately, there's a wonderful thing called BBC iPlayer where I can watch it on catch-up.
What do you make, Marsha, of this? I mean, do you think it should be reopened now, properly, in the investigation looked at?
Obviously, I mean, I've started to watch it, and I didn't watch last night's final episode, but I will be going on to catch up to see it. But obviously, it has been 40 years, and you know, for these new developments to happen, then it would make sense possibly that this should be opened up again. I think it's a...
The investigation is opened again.
It was essentially a snapshot of the 70s. That's what politics were like. That's what various establishments were like. You know, the Director General of the BBC, the head of MI5, the Home Secretary, the Director of Public Prosecutions, they all thought in the same way, which was that they should look after a member of their own who was in trouble. Now, I don't think that could happen again today, but it wasn't that long ago when it could, and it did happen.
Well, Tom Mangold, I'm relieved the dog didn't chew the whole thing up, as I'm sure 1.6 million other people are too. Thanks for coming in. Now, let's get more on Home Secretary Sajid Javid's speech on the government's updated counter-terrorism strategy, because joining us now is the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, as promised, Max Hill. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Did you like what you heard, Max, from Sajid Javid?
Good afternoon. Well, this is obviously a major step in the road. This is the consequence of the operational improvement review which government put itself through in response to the awful attacks in London and Manchester last year. And I think by relaunching Contest, by indicating some new legislation coming down the road, the Home Secretary was saying this is our flexible response, both to intelligence handling, information sharing, and dealing with modern terrorism in the ways in which it happens in 2018. And I think a large part of what he said was welcome, was constructive, and was probably proportionate, dealing with what we face.
You said it's a sort of flexible response. Is it also fighting terrorism on the cheap?
I'm not sure that you could say it's fighting it on the cheap, although resource and money has nothing to do with me. There are eye-watering sums that government votes to counter-terrorism, and within that counter-terrorism policing, and the Home Secretary was signalling an intention to continue with that. But one of the major proposals he was making, which in turn followed the recommendations of my predecessor, David Anderson, when he reviewed the OIR, was to share intelligence more widely and earlier. And that's clearly a sensible thing. I think what we have in mind now is that instead of holding information to themselves, the intelligence services and counter-terrorism policing will reach out in the first place to community-based policing to say, well, this is what we know about individuals, you're part of the policing network, we want your assistance. I don't think that's answering the problem on the cheap, but it's all about how it's done, how robustly it's done, what degree of flexibility is shown.
Reaching out in the way that you've just described is one response, but if there are currently 500 operations watching 3,000 people and a further 20,000 who may pose a threat, how can a democratic society keep a watch on all those people effectively?
Well, we've been warned, haven't we, and the Home Secretary repeated it today, to manage our expectations. It is not possible. The Director General of MI5 has said it repeatedly, to stop every plot. However, albeit that we had ghastly events in London and Manchester last year, there's a really high strike rate in terms of what policing and the intelligence community manage. They are well resourced. They have very high numbers of staff and analysts. They may need more of that. That's an argument for them to make, not for me. And it's about taking down as much of this activity as possible. And we must wish them luck with that work.
Do you think the PREVENT strategy, which is unpopular with certain sections of the community, but which is going to be continued, this early intervention at a sort of community level, is it working?
Well, PREVENT is misunderstood by lots of people at all levels of society. Whenever I go out of London and, let's say, interact with the Muslim community, wherever that may be around the country, a lot of people, understandably, I think, feel that it's targeted at them. It isn't. Government repeatedly says that. There's a spectrum of violent extremist activity, much of which comes from the extreme right wing, just as much as it comes from Daesh-inspired terrorism. And PREVENT is there to try to deal with incipient violence, incipient extremism, wherever it crops up in our society. So PREVENT needs to be understood. It's only one part of the jigsaw, but it is an important part of the jigsaw, and for that reason, it seems to me, it's here to stay.
Just finally, it's reported in The Guardian today that the security services are concerned about a surge in the number of convicted terrorists being released from prison. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think, obviously, we do have to be concerned. We do have a significant number serving sentences, many of whom, in my former life, I prosecuted, I have to say. One of the things that the Home Secretary announced today was intentions to introduce more strength in the management of offenders post-release. We'll have to wait to see precisely what that means, but the contest strategy now talks about desist and disengagement, a programme that is, as it were, an adjunct to PREVENT, which is intended to keep sight on individuals even long after they've been released from prison. It's clearly a necessary part of the intelligence framework in this country, provided that it doesn't simply consign people to longer sentences for something for which they've not been convicted. But I don't think that's the intention behind the programme. It's to use proportionate measures.
Max Hill, independent reviewer of terrorism there. Thank you. Now, later today, MPs will debate a planned ban on the sale of ivory. The government is proposing an almost complete ban, with only limited exemptions for objects with a small percentage of ivory and some historical items. Well, our reporter, Ellie Price, can tell us more. Ellie.
Yeah, Joe, this is a debate that's going to happen this afternoon in Parliament. The Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, said that if it goes through, this will be the toughest ban on ivory sale, or one of the toughest bans in the whole world. Now, what it will see is, as you say, an extension of the existing rules in ivory sales with some exemptions. So, for example, items that are made up of less than 10% of ivory, musical instruments that are made up of less than 20%, and those sort of museum quality items that can be traded in between museums. Now, the Environment Secretary says this will reduce the market in this country, at least, for something that sees the poaching of at least 20,000 elephants every year. That's 55 elephants every single day. And it came as a result of a consultation that saw 70,000 people respond, and 88% of them said they did back a ban. Not all of them did, of course, though, and one of them was Michael Baggott, who joins me now. You probably recognise him, Joe, from the BBC's Flog It programme. Why do you oppose this ban?
I oppose this ban because I don't oppose this ban. We've actually had a ban on ivory in this country for 43 years, and this is something that hasn't been made clear to the public. What I'm opposing is the very sensible and clear exemptions that were placed in 1975 to protect historic objects from destruction.
But they haven't been working, because clearly there are plenty of elephants still being poached for their tusks.
They absolutely are, and that problem is driven through corruption and violence in Africa and through demand in the Chinese market. But it has absolutely nothing to do with our national treasures. The Chinese have absolutely no interest in Western art whatsoever. Okay. And if we go ahead and destroy these objects, we are losing them and the elephants.
Well, let's see some of these objects, as you brought them today.
Well, I mean, this is just a humble sweetmeat fork.
Right.
And I did joke on social media that, but it's absolutely true, if this exemption is removed, because this is over the 10% de minimis.
Hang on, de minimis, it's a good word.
It means basically 10% of the object by volume has to be ivory. It's 10% or less. So because that handle is about 40% of it, if I attempted to sell this, even though it's 300 years old and has no connection to the illegal trade, I could face an unlimited fine and 5 years in prison.
And similarly, this one, I'm assuming?
This one, it's a superb example. The handle is 17th century Italian. The problem is that we're focusing on ivory carvings. Actually, ivory was as ubiquitous as plastic is today for thousands of years.
Oh, let's not get into plastic, because obviously that's another thing.
No, that's another thing. But it basically means you find it in almost everything.
But if this is less wonderful, why can't the museums look after it?
The museum exemptions have to be for something that is so rare and that they don't have examples of. There are 4 of these in the V&A. So they might argue, quite sensibly, well, we're not going to issue an exemption for a 5th, we have 4. The problem comes that these objects also have an element which is of intrinsic value.
Which is the silver.
Which is the silver. So even though this fork is worth £4,000, if this ban is passed, it is worth nothing to its owner.
Apart from the silver, the scrap.
Apart from the silver. And the only way they can sell it is if they smash the handle off and melt the silver down.
Right, and you've brought me this. I can't see any... Why have you brought
me this? You can't see any reason for me bringing this. Can you see?
Actually, there's a little bit of ivory there, isn't there?
There's an ivory fillet in it. It's very common.
Would that be fine? That's less than 10%?
It's less than 10%. But every time this is sold, it requires certification. And I've been dead against certification from day one.
Why?
Because it's open to corruption. It has to be enforceable. And the logistics of it are a nightmare. You have to show this to someone who understands what it is to get a certificate.
Right.
There are 20,000 antique dealers in the country. Each of them will have at least 20 objects. Okay. So the day after this is passed, you will have to issue 400,000 certificates. How long will that take?
OK, Michael, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
OK.
Well, as I say, the debate gets underway at 2:30 in Parliament this afternoon.
Ellie, thank you. That was our corner of the Antiques Roadshow, I think, with those very beautiful items. Marsha, would you go for a complete ban? Or are you persuaded by Michael's arguments to preserve historical items?
Well, the Labour Party in our manifesto last year, we talked about banning the sale of ivory. And obviously, as we debate it this afternoon, we fully support the bill that will be going before Parliament today.
I think the problem was that the pre-1947 exemption was being abused, and that's why the Act is being drafted in the way that it is, to make sure that it's almost a total ban, apart from those historical items. And it doesn't mean that they are destroyed. It means that they can be passed down through families. You're not required to destroy old historical items that you may hold, but you can't sell them, you can't profit from it, and I think that's right.
All right, well, thank you both very much. Thanks to our guests of the day. The 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now. Of course, I'll be back tomorrow. We'll have all the big political stories of the day. We'll be discussing them in depth with our guests. Make sure you join me then tomorrow from all of us here. Bye-bye.